Man dares to save an injured lion, and what happens next will make you believe in the impossible. Samuel Turner, at 30 years old, was a free-spirited man. A native of California, he had left behind his comfortable life in the United States to venture into Africa, where he spent years working as a biologist in the vast savanna. He fell in love with the wild nature and the big cats that ruled the land. Over the years, he developed a deep connection with the animals, especially the lions. But after many years in Africa, Samuel had returned to America, where he opened a wildlife rehabilitation center. Still, his heart never left the savanna. On a hot and sunny day, Samuel received a call that gave him an inexplicable sense of urgency. It was an old friend from Africa, a big game hunter who now worked in animal rescue and rehabilitation. His friend's voice was tense. "Samuel, we found an injured lion in the savanna. He's in critical condition, and no one knows what to do with him. I know you have a connection with these animals. You need to come." Without hesitation, Samuel packed his things and boarded the next flight to Africa. He knew that rescuing an injured lion was a difficult and risky task, but there was something in his friend's voice, a sense of urgency, that made him feel this lion was different. Perhaps it was destiny calling him back to the land he loved so much. When Samuel arrived at the location, he was taken to the savanna, where the lion was being kept in an improvised enclosure. Ragnar, a huge lion with a dark and thick mane, was lying down, his eyes closed in pain. The deep wounds on his hind legs made it clear he had fought against something much larger than himself. But what affected Samuel the most were not the physical injuries, but the sadness in the lion's eyes, as if that gaze carried not just pain, but a weight of history and suffering that no one could understand. The lion was suspicious of everyone around him, and none of the other caretakers seemed brave enough to approach. Samuel, however, didn't hesitate. He slowly moved closer, with the calm of someone who understands the behavior of a wild animal. Ragnar growled lowly, but Samuel, taking his time, crouched down slowly and spoke gently, trying to calm him. There was something about his presence, something familiar to the lion, as if, in some way, he knew that Samuel did not pose a threat. With careful movements, Samuel was able to get close enough to examine Ragnar's wounds. He knew the lion was badly injured, but what he didn't know was that this encounter would change everything. The connection between them seemed immediate, as if, for a brief moment, time had stopped. The lion, still wary, seemed to accept Samuel's help, as if, on some level, he understood that he was the only chance of survival. What Samuel couldn't imagine at that moment was that, by saving Ragnar, he was about to experience something that would challenge everything he thought was possible. Fate had called him back to the savanna for something far greater than he could ever have imagined. And what would happen next would make Samuel believe that, at times, the impossible truly can become reality. Samuel never planned to get so deeply involved with Ragnar, but the gravity of the situation pushed him to act. The injured lion was weakened, and Samuel knew he needed to help. The solution was to take Ragnar to a rehabilitation center, but for that to happen, it was crucial that the lion began to trust him. In the following days, Samuel approached slowly, trying to understand both the fierceness and the fragility of Ragnar. What he didn't expect was that, over time, the lion would start to respond to his gestures in subtle yet powerful ways. Each day, Samuel found himself more involved, growing closer. Ragnar, with his wounds and pain, seemed to be more than just an injured lion. There was something else in his eyes, a vulnerability that Samuel couldn't ignore. When the lion allowed himself to relax and trust the man, something remarkable happened. He no longer growled, no longer showed signs of aggression. There was a silent acceptance that Samuel was his only chance for survival. And for the biologist, this was something that went beyond any scientific explanation. After 3 days, a subtle but powerful transformation began to take place. Ragnar, still weak, showed signs of improvement. One afternoon, while Samuel was tending to the lion's wounds, something almost impossible happened. Ragnar struggled to rise, leaning only on his front legs, and locked eyes with Samuel. It was a moment of connection, where the lion, in his fragility, seemed to thank him. What Samuel couldn't predict was that this simple gesture would mark the beginning of something much deeper and more inexplicable. Every gesture from Ragnar now seemed like a silent conversation between them. Samuel knew he was approaching something that could be extraordinary, but also dangerous. A wild lion trusting a man seemed against all odds. Yet, the connection that was forming was undeniable. Ragnar wasn't just surviving. He was responding to the man with an intelligence and sensitivity that Samuel didn't believe possible in a wild animal. Samuel felt like part of something bigger, as if he had been chosen for something beyond reason. Ragnar, the lion who once was an untamable beast, now seemed more than that. He was a companion, someone who shared with Samuel a pain and a struggle for survival. What came next, Samuel couldn't imagine. He was about to discover that his life and Ragnar's were more intertwined than he could have ever predicted. As the days passed, the bond between Samuel and Ragnar grew stronger and clearer. The lion, who had initially shown so much resistance and distrust, now seemed to follow every move Samuel made with watchful eyes, almost as if waiting for his guidance. Samuel, in turn, didn't know how, but he felt that he was gaining more than just the trust of an injured animal. He was becoming part of Ragnar's life in a way that surpassed any experience he'd had with wild animals. The next morning, Samuel decided to take Ragnar to a small makeshift shelter nearby, where the lion could rest more comfortably. As he carefully led him there, Ragnar followed without hesitation, a clear sign that his trust was stronger than before. Along the way, Samuel found himself intrigued by Ragnar's behavior. Instead of pulling away or becoming aggressive, as a wild lion was expected to do, he moved closer to Samuel, almost as if seeking his protection. This left Samuel puzzled, unsure of what this meant. After all, lions are fierce animals, not creatures of affection. Inside the shelter, Samuel prepared a safe area for the lion. As Ragnar settled in, the biologist allowed himself to reflect on what was happening. He wondered if the lion truly saw him as an ally or if he had merely resigned himself to the situation. However, the lion's behavior seemed to indicate something different, something that went beyond simple survival instincts. Ragnar, in his weakened state, was showing a type of dependence that Samuel never imagined a wild animal could develop for a human. Time passed, and more, Ragnar began to respond to Samuel's simple commands. When the lion, though still weakened, followed Samuel to where he was preparing the food, a sense of something extraordinary filled the air. It wasn't just an animal reacting to the instinct of survival. It seemed as though Ragnar was following something greater. Samuel found himself taken aback by the thought that perhaps his help was, in fact, more meaningful than he had ever imagined. What had once seemed like a simple rescue of an animal in danger was now unfolding as a journey of mutual transformation. That night, as Samuel watched Ragnar lying on his makeshift bed, a sense of complicity lingered in the air. They were connected in an inexplicable way. Ragnar, the fierce lion of the African savanna, had found an ally in a man who also carried his own scars and pains. But the story unfolding between them was far from simple. Something deeper was happening, something Samuel was beginning to understand but still couldn't describe. He knew deep down that their fates were irreversibly intertwined, but what that meant for both of them, he couldn't yet imagine. The following days were marked by a tense calm, where the relationship between Samuel and Ragnar seemed to be evolving into something more complex than just mutual help. The lion, although still fragile, began to display an intelligence that defied any expectation Samuel had about the behavior of a wild animal. Ragnar was no longer the aggressive and distrustful lion he once was, but a being with a depth that Samuel never imagined he would find in an animal. It seemed as if he was learning from the man just as much as the man was learning from him. Samuel didn't know if this change was natural due to Ragnar's recovery, or if there was something more at play. The lion, as instinctual as he was developing an emotional connection with Samuel that seemed almost human. The biologist couldn't help but wonder, was this possible? A lion beginning to understand man in such an intimate way? But he had no clear answers. All he knew was that he was starting to feel a growing responsibility for Ragnar, as if he were more than just an animal, but someone who shared his own journey of pain and overcoming. One afternoon, As Samuel was preparing the shelter for another day of care, something happened that made his heart race. Ragnar, once somewhat reclusive, stood up and walked towards Samuel. In an unusual gesture, he touched Samuel's hand with his head, as if in a gesture of gratitude or recognition. It was a silent moment, but one filled with meaning, which made Samuel question his own views on wild animals. He had always known that lions were majestic and powerful creatures, but he never imagined that one could be so vulnerable and, at the same time, so trustworthy. That simple gesture deeply moved Samuel. In that instant, he understood that there was something beyond reason happening. Ragnar, with his natural ferocity and survival story in the savannah, now found himself in a position of dependency that led him to trust Samuel, even to the point of expressing his recognition. For the biologist, this was more than a sign of friendship between species. It seemed to be the confirmation of a theory he had never dared to consider. Maybe wild animals, in their essence, shared with humans more than just the instinct for survival. Perhaps they also carried a sense of connection, something almost spiritual. But while Samuel tried to understand the meaning of that moment, he still didn't know that that small exchange of trust between him and Ragnar was just the beginning. The lion, still wounded, was about to take the biologist to a place he had never imagined. Something that would happen in the next few hours would make Samuel confront his very understanding of nature and the impossible. The story unfolding before him would challenge everything he believed to be true about the animal world, and even about himself. The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, when Samuel heard a strange sound coming from the nearby forest. Ragnar, who had been resting in his area up until then, suddenly rose, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The lion, still recovering from his injuries, seemed to sense something that eluded Samuel's perception. He moved forward with steady steps, as if he were being called by something invisible. Samuel hesitated for a moment, but his instincts urged him to follow the lion, not fully understanding what was happening. As they neared the edge of the forest, Samuel noticed movement in the shadows. The sound grew louder, and he soon realized what was going on. Another group of lions appeared, threatening to invade Ragnar's territory. It was an impressive and terrifying sight. Ragnar, still wounded, was facing a real challenge. His own territory was being threatened, and the battle for the savannah was fast approaching. Samuel felt a chill of fear. He knew Ragnar didn't have the strength to face other lions, especially in his current condition. The biologist watched in shock as Ragnar positioned himself in front of Samuel, as if to protect him. The lion, despite his disadvantage, didn't hesitate to place himself between Samuel and the threat. He was ready to fight. Samuel, desperate, felt the weight of responsibility to intervene. But what could he do against the raw, relentless force of nature? He was just a man, and Ragnar, though now his friend, was an animal of instinct. And the fight was about to begin. Suddenly, in an unexpected move, Ragnar growled with a force and authority that Samuel never imagined a wounded lion could display. He roared so loudly that the sound echoed across the savannah, causing the other lions to hesitate. It was an unexpected show of strength, something that made the other lions stop and watch, as if questioning their decision to confront this injured lion. Ragnar, with his imposing stance and fixed gaze, seemed to challenge anyone who dared cross his path. Fear was replaced by determination. He was, in some way, showing Samuel that true strength didn't come just from the body, but from the will to protect and the courage to fight, no matter the circumstances. Samuel, completely overwhelmed by the scene before him, could hardly believe what was happening. The wounded lion he had rescued was, in some way, now challenging the savagery of his own kind. It was a display of loyalty and courage that transcended any rational understanding. But Samuel knew that this moment of tension wouldn't last long. The real battle was about to take place, and he would have to make a decision that would change the course of his journey, and perhaps his life, forever. The air was thick with tension, and the savannah seemed in absolute silence, as if the entire world was waiting for the next move. Samuel watched, his heart racing, as Ragnar stood firm in front of the other lions. It was clear that the leader of the invading group was hesitating, but his hunger and leadership instincts were pushing him toward confrontation. Samuel, seeing Ragnar's courage, knew he couldn't just stand there. His gaze, fixed on the injured lion, was one of admiration but also silent anguish, for he knew there was nothing more he could do but watch. The first move came quickly, like a lightning bolt cutting through the silence. The lead lion of the invading group lunged, his sharp claws ready to strike. Ragnar, with surprising speed for someone so weakened, prepared for the clash. The fight was fierce and brutal. Ragnar's roar echoed through the savannah as he used his remaining strength to try to hold his ground. The invading lion's strike was swift, but Ragnar dodged with a skill that defied his physical condition, landing a solid blow that made the opponent retreat, surprised by the injured lion's resilience. Samuel, stunned, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ragnar, with his open wounds and still fighting for his life, was defying fate. The battle, which seemed like a fight for survival, was being fought on a much deeper level. Ragnar wasn't just defending his territory. He was showing a spiritual strength that Samuel never imagined an animal could possess. The fight continued, with the invading lions retreating and advancing, trying to find a gap in Ragnar's defense. But even so, the injured lion held his ground, as if telling the world that, even wounded, he would not surrender. Meanwhile, the sky darkened, and the stars began to appear one by one, reflecting the gravity of the moment. Samuel, with trembling hands, found himself torn between rushing to help or waiting to see how things would unfold. He knew that nature followed its own rules, and if Ragnar failed, he wouldn't stand a chance against the group of lions. However, something inside Samuel told him that Ragnar wouldn't fail. He wasn't just seeing a lion fight. He was seeing the embodiment of hope, resilience, and the inner strength that transcends circumstances. Then, as if it were a sign that the end was near, Ragnar let out one last powerful roar that echoed through the savannah, causing all the lions to hesitate. The leader of the invading group, surprised by the strength of the wounded lion, began to slowly retreat. Soon, all the other lions followed his lead. Ragnar's territory was safe, at least for now. Samuel, speechless, watched the scene with a mix of relief and gratitude. The wounded lion he had saved had kept his promise, and now he had become not just his friend, but a living legend, someone who defied the laws of nature and survival. The silence after the battle was almost deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the savannah. Samuel, still in shock, watched Ragnar, who was now lying down, exhausted, but still alive. The lion seemed to be breathing heavily, his eyes wide and focused, as if aware of the significance of this moment. The fight had left its marks, but it had also formed something deeper, something Samuel couldn't fully understand. The man, used to working with wildlife from a distance, now felt an indescribable connection with this animal, something that went beyond mere compassion. Even in his fragility, Ragnar still maintained an impressive presence. He looked at Samuel, and for a brief moment, the man felt that the lion was recognizing him, as if thanking him for the help. Samuel kneeled beside Ragnar, inspecting the lion's wounds and feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He knew Ragnar wouldn't survive for long on his own, especially with the physical and emotional trauma from the fight. But the man wasn't ready to lose that bond, wasn't ready to watch that lion disappear without trying to do more for him. With the care of a doctor, Samuel used what he had available in his makeshift first aid kit. It wasn't the best treatment, but it was all he could do. He cleaned the lion's wounds, applying what he could to stop the bleeding and ease the pain. The lion, unusual for animal behavior, seemed to understand that the man was doing everything he could to help him. There was a respect in Ragnar's eyes that made Samuel believe that, somehow, the lion understood the extent of the man's sacrifice. As the sun began to set, Samuel reflected on how life had brought him to this point. These lands, so far from his home in America, were now shaping his existence in ways he hadn't expected. He had come to the savannah seeking answers about animal behavior, but now he was living a much deeper story, something no book or study could have prepared him for. He knew that Ragnar, in his own way, was also starting to trust him, something almost unimaginable for a lion. The bond between them was beginning to take root in ways Samuel could never have predicted. The evening heat in the savannah surrounded them, and the man felt a quiet peace, despite the tension still hanging in the air. Ragnar, though wounded, was calmer now, and the trust that had formed between them seemed to withstand everything, even the challenges that lay ahead. Samuel knew the struggles were far from over, but something in his heart told him that with Ragnar by his side, he could face anything that came their way. Their journey, though difficult and filled with danger, was now intertwined in a unique way, with a new purpose that Samuel was still trying to understand. The morning heat felt more intense than usual. Samuel, who had spent the night beside Ragnar, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The lion, though calmer, was still visibly injured, and the signs of weakness were evident. The fact that Ragnar had survived the night was a small victory, but Samuel knew the recovery would be long and full of challenges. He couldn't help but wonder how much longer the lion could endure without the help of a specialized veterinarian. The savannah around them seemed indifferent to Ragnar's situation, with its vast and imposing landscapes. For Samuel, however, the environment was a constant reminder that they were in the middle of a fight for survival, and time was running out. He knew that in order to keep caring for the lion, he would need to find a way to the nearest village to get supplies and help. The journey would be risky, but there was no other option. Ragnar needed more care than Samuel could provide on his own. With great difficulty, Samuel managed to lift the lion and began walking, leading him through the dry trees of the savannah. Ragnar, though still exhausted, seemed to understand what was happening. The lion moved slowly, his steps heavy, but with a silent determination. Samuel felt a deep connection with him, as if fate had bound them together irreversibly. They were more intertwined than ever, with a bond that went beyond the physical. As they moved forward, Samuel began to realize how full of surprises life in the savannah could be. A strange sound caught his attention, and on instinct he stopped immediately, holding the lion. Looking around, he saw a herd of antelopes moving quickly, and the ground trembling with the approach of a predator. It didn't take long for the danger to become clear. A group of hyenas was approaching, drawn to the presence of the injured lion. Samuel knew they needed to leave quickly. His heart racing, he tried to hurry Ragnar along, but the lion was too weak to run. The man looked to the horizon, seeing the hyenas drawing closer. Time was running out, and somehow, he felt that this would be the final test of his journey. With Ragnar still by his side, he needed to escape, or everything he had done so far would have been for nothing. Samuel felt his heart race as he saw Ragnar rise with unexpected strength. The lion, though still visibly weakened, seemed to have found a new burst of energy upon sensing the imminent danger. Ragnar's roar echoed across the savannah, a deep and powerful sound that, for a moment, made even the hyenas hesitate. Samuel froze, amazed by the lion's determination, and at the same time, fearful that his strength might not be enough to drive the predators away. When the hyenas saw the lion standing and roaring, they seemed to reconsider their strategy, but hunger still controlled them. They began to close in, advancing slowly and methodically. Samuel knew that to protect Ragnar, he needed to act. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, he grabbed another stone. But this time, instead of throwing it, he charged toward the hyenas, shouting and making aggressive movements. He knew he had to intimidate them to buy time. Then, the unexpected happened. Ragnar charged toward the hyenas with a speed and agility Samuel never imagined he had in his condition. The lion, with his imposing presence, was like a whirlwind, driving the hyenas back with his sharp claws and terrifying roar. Samuel, in shock, watched as the lion faced the hyenas alone. Like a true warrior of the savannah, he felt a mix of fear and admiration, knowing that he could do no more. Ragnar was making the impossible happen. The hyenas, now intimidated by the lion's strength, slowly retreated before finally giving up the hunt. The silence that followed was deafening, with Samuel and Ragnar panting, both still processing what had just happened. The man approached the lion, who was now exhausted but victorious. Ragnar looked at Samuel with his golden eyes, as if thanking him for the help, even though the man knew it was actually the lion who had saved them both. Samuel felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and respect for the wild animal that, against all odds, had fought for its life with a ferocity Samuel hadn't known he possessed. The bond between them was clearer than ever. The lion wasn't just an injured animal seeking help. It was a true symbol of resilience and courage. Samuel knew that although the battle against the hyenas had been won, the real fight for survival was just beginning. Night began to fall slowly over the savannah, and the temperature dropped. Samuel and Ragnar were exhausted, but a sense of victory hung in the air. The hyenas had backed off, and the man was now alone with the lion. The sound of the wind rustling through the dry trees and the distant calls of other wild animals set the tone that danger might be far, but it wasn't completely out of sight. Samuel knew that for both of them, the greatest challenge was still ahead. Ragnar was standing, but visibly weakened. The lion's wounds, though not fatal, required urgent attention. Samuel knew there wasn't much time. Using the skills he had acquired in Africa, he began to improvise with the resources around him. Branches and leaves to try to stop Ragnar's bleeding and treat his wounds. Samuel felt the weight of every second that passed, the fear that the lion wouldn't survive the pain and exhaustion. But there was something else, something indescribable, that kept him steady. The bond he now shared with Ragnar. In the silence of the savannah, while Samuel worked to care for the lion, something happened that seemed to defy logic. Ragnar, with all his grandeur and strength, suddenly lay down beside Samuel, his body still bearing clear signs of pain, but with an expression of trust in the man. It was as if the lion was telling him that, even in his vulnerability, he trusted Samuel. This gesture, though simple, was one of the most profound for the man, who felt an indescribable emotion. He had helped Ragnar, but in that moment, the lion was repaying him in a way Samuel had never imagined. As the night deepened, Samuel noticed that Ragnar was starting to fall asleep, his breathing more peaceful despite the pain. The image of the lion lying next to him, eyes closed, made the man reflect on everything that had happened. He thought about the journey he had started, the difficulties he had faced, and the unique bond he had formed with one of the wildest creatures on Earth. He couldn't let that night be the end of Ragnar's story. He knew, deep down, there was something deeper at play, something that went beyond mere survival. The following morning brought a desolate scene. The sky was clear and blue, but the traces of the previous night, the battle for life and survival, were still present. Samuel got up, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Ragnar was still there, but the man knew the lion couldn't be left alone for much longer. There was still a long way to go. He would have to fight against the obstacles of nature, but more importantly, he would fight to ensure that the bond he shared with that lion was stronger than any challenge ahead. The true test of his courage was still to come. At that moment, as the sun rose over the vastness of the savannah, Samuel knew that by saving Ragnar, he had transformed. He was no longer just an ordinary man, but someone who, by doing the impossible, had discovered a new meaning to his own existence. With Ragnar by his side, he would not only save the lion, but in some way he would also save himself.